Hello my friends, welcome back to Milk and Cookies Total War. Settle in, grab some Oreos, munch on some Nestle Toll House, hashtag not sponsored yet, get your dipping milk, and snuggle in for the long ride as we break down yet another pillar of the Ruinous Pantheon, and how they will be implemented in Total War Warhammer 3. So far, we've covered the Dark Prince Slaanesh and his sensual exploits in the Immaterium, getting down with her bad self in the warp alongside all her little minions. Then we talked about Grandpappy Nurgle, the Rot Father, spreading bloated disease and glorious decay wherever his jovial armies march. And in those videos, I laid the groundwork for how I'd like to see the Forces of Chaos take shape in Warhammer 3. We've covered it a few times already, so we're going to make this quick, but just so we're on the same page once again, I think Chaos would be at its best and brightest if by the end of this trilogy, there were 6 chaotic factions. A Daemons of Chaos Undivided faction led by Be'lakor the Dark Master, a Warriors of Chaos Undivided faction led by Archaon the Everchosen and Kolek Suneater, and then 4 separate god-specific rosters that would combine the mortals and demons associated with each god. We'd have marked Chaos Warriors, Knights, Cultists, and Chosen with unique stats and visuals fighting alongside demons under the same banner. The idea here would be to roll the unique aesthetic and flavor of each Chaos god into a combined roster with all the strengths and all the weaknesses inherent in that particular playstyle. That is the best way to ensure we get the maximum amount of regiments of renown, named characters, special units, and unique playstyles that Chaos is deserving of as the driving force and catalyst for change in the Warhammer Fantasy Battle universe. And speaking of change, we've got a lot to discuss on that front today. Now, I still think there needs to be a good faction on launch, and I sincerely doubt we'll only be getting Chaos factions on day 1, so my opinion as of this moment is that we will likely get the Demons of Chaos Undivided, Ogre Kingdoms, Chaos Dwarfs, and Kislev as the starting 4 playable factions. And then additional named characters and chaotic factions will come as DLC and free LC later on. But it's entirely possible Ogres or Chaos Dwarfs drop later as DLC, and that the Warriors will get their complete overhaul and missing units as part of a package deal on launch day. No matter how it's done, I guarantee you Chaos Warriors are going to get a huge overhaul and new toys to play with at some point, so have no fear. We will be seeing Chaos Dwarfs and Ogre Kingdoms make a massive splash as well. But we're here today to talk about one god and one god only, a being of infinite knowledge and malevolence that has dwelled in the ether for eons, a being of light and darkness, of twisted ambition and timeless betrayal. The Raven God, the changer of ways, the liar prince, Tzeentch, chaos god of magic, mutation, and transformation. A god the great Ty Lopez and all men of wisdom and learning flock to in their darkest hours. So we'll be discussing the armies of this Lord of Change, the realm he's carved out for himself in the Immaterium, his champions and legendary lords, both mortal and demon, and how this faction could be implemented in Game 3. If you just want to watch the world burn while controlling some of the most insane and alien unit designs in the entirety of the setting, this might just be the faction for you. Like the other Chaos gods, Tzeentch was formed in the warp from the collective experiences and emotions of those on the mortal plane. But in that primordial age before sentience, before conscious thought, when prehistoric monsters roamed the world and evolution began its inexorable journey, a single seed was planted. A malevolent cunning that grew in the Immaterium as the fires of change reshaped the world and mutation racked the creatures that lived there. Over the eons, this consciousness would grow and begin to feed on the paranoia, the hope, and the ambition of the people that lived there, a nectar and a source of nourishment that only sentience could provide. And it was during this mythic age, when the old ones were terraforming, flesh sculpting, and ultimately screwing things up for the umpteenth time, that the ruinous powers made their presence felt, and put the war into Warhammer. This cataclysmic war in heaven was a time of Tzeentch and his ascendancy, a time of anarchy and unrestrained schemes of magic that whipped and wormed their way throughout the world, a time of demons and mutation, and an end to the old way of things, a time of chaos. But the other gods saw Tzeentch's glory and grew jealous, and jealousy turned to fear as the god of sorcerers plucked the strings of fate itself. So the ruinous powers turned on their brother, and one by one, they were cast into the void until it was only Khorne who stood before the Raven, pitting steel against sorcery in a clash of wits and brawn that must have felt like Armageddon. In the end, Khorne cast down the Changer and smote his ruin upon the mountainside, leaving his form shattered into 10,000 pieces that flew across eternity, each shard becoming one of the spells we know and love so dearly, the incantations used by mortals and demons to summon prisms of light, waves of molten lava, and portals to the warp. And so his ungraceful fall made maybe the largest impact on the mortal plane of any Chaos God ever, which was the gift of magic and the incantations necessary to control it. But nevertheless, Tzeentch was thrown down from his perch as preeminent deity on the chaotic pantheon, and Khorne took his place, and there he still remains. Now, during the reign of Emperor Karl Franz, Tzeentch is considered the second strongest Chaos God, with Khorne being the most powerful, Nurgle third, and Tzeentch being the youngest and most newly formed in the Imagarium, the weakest. But as emotions and history itself shift like the tides, each of these gods kind of wax and wane in power, and depending on what's happening on the mortal plane at any given time, any one of their stars can be ascendant at a given moment. So much like Chaos itself, the borders and powers of their realms are in a constant state of flux and change, which suits our boy Tzeentch just fine, because that is how he thrives, in the maelstrom of madness, plucking the strings of fate, deceiving and tricking as his infinitely complex plans fall into place, just as planned. So there are a couple things to note about Tzeentch. For one, he's probably the least overt of the Chaos Gods, which is ironic because he's the one most closely associated with rapid evolution and mutation. The unchecked cell growth of a Chaos Spawn is kind of his signature calling card. But where Khorne is all about getting up in your face and slicing it off with a big blazing axe, Nurgle wants to spread the love with some big ol' infectious blubber, and Tzeentch wants to spread some STDs in an altogether different manner. Tzeentch is all about the long game, the scheming, the planning, and the plotting in the dark underbelly of civilization, the cabals and cults that worm their way through the roots of empire stretching from the old world to far Cathay. Tzeentch is Game of Thrones when Game of Thrones was actually good, Littlefinger and Varys when they weren't complete idiots. Chaos is Alada, a spirit that's all about feeding your ambition, ego, and thirst for power, only to pull the rug out from under you and enslave you to its will. He's also the Chaos God who cares the least about his patrons. I mean, certainly, lords and champions are disposable commodities to even the jolly green grandfather Nurgle, who is by far the most family-friendly of the bunch, but Tzeentch really, honestly, truly could not give less of a sheet about the mortals and demons who worship his name. They exist for one purpose, and one purpose only, to further his own limitless ambition in the great cosmic game. And he's not above throwing millions of his own lackeys into the torment of hellfire to see his plans come to fruition. And that's what makes Tzeentch so dangerous, besides the obvious cataclysmic world-ending power that he wields, that his greatest defeats are his greatest victories, that his most illogical strategies are the ones that leave his enemies most vulnerable, that nothing he does makes any goddamn sense, but that sometimes decades or even centuries later, the seeds he planted spring back to virulent life, and his plans come home to roost. And when Tzeentch is roosting in your own backyard, giggling, rubbing his grubby little Cheeto feathers together, you know you're in for a bad time. But like all the ruinous powers, Tzeentch isn't a caricature of cackling, cartoonish evil, at least not always. There is nuance to his followers, elements of his ideals that are worth aspiring to. He represents progress, knowledge, curiosity, purity of will, and a desire to improve oneself. And these are all qualities that are worth pursuing. The issue is when they become feverish and consuming, when they utterly take over one's life and push them to deeper and darker acts. That is when the Raven God feeds, and how he derives power from the mortal plane, which is true for the other Chaos Gods as well. Having sex with your wife does not empower Tzeentch. Hunting a deer does not empower Khorne. Taking a nasty dump does not empower Nurgle. Reading a book does not empower Tzeentch. It's when those are taken 10, 15, 20 steps too far, like when Egram von Horseman burned dozens of priceless, ageless, irreplaceable tomes in the Pyramid of Light to satisfy the Changer's thirst for knowledge, that is when the gods look down upon the world and smile. Now, in terms of rivalries amongst the ruinous pantheon, the current lore pits Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Tzeentch against one another. Nurgle symbolizes stagnation and slow, inexorable entropy, while Tzeentch prefers viral and virulent change, fast and all-consuming. Nurgle is born of despair and hopelessness, while Tzeentch embodies the hope and ambition of humanity. There are elements of their philosophy that overlap, but it basically boils down to the Atheist Alliance factions in South Park, if you've ever seen that episode. Factions that ultimately have many of the same goals and ideals, yet end up killing each other over their not-so-subtle differences. Come to think of it, it probably was Big Bird who screwed with the timelines and made Cartman oversleep 10,000 years into the future so he could play the Wii. Sounds like a practical joke Tzeentch would very much enjoy. Warhammer and South Park, most ambitious crossover since Infinity War. But in terms of outright conflict between the Raven and the Crow, I'd say Tzeentch unequivocally has the advantage. Overwhelming firepower literally is the best way to counter slow, regenerating brutes. And the flames of change his followers spew can cook even the hardiest Nurgle champions inside their armor. Even on the tabletop, flame is a hard counter to regeneration, while discs and screamers can run circles around a slower opponent. Now there are a few characteristics that the Raven God looks for in a devotee. An uncompromising desire for knowledge is probably the most important, paired with unquenchable ambition. Those are the nectars that Tzeentch most adores, and you can find those traits in just about every single champion he fields. But be warned, if you want to be on his team, you gotta make a payment first. In return, Tzeentch will have your soul, and you will not refuse, for you will not suffer your genius to be snuffed out, and you always knew that one day you would pay the changer his due. It's a very interesting interplay between the Raven and his followers, because by their very nature, they're both incredibly duplicitous. Whether it's minor cultists or greater demons, there's a reason he's called the Liar Prince, and his followers follow that exact same kind of logic. And the oaths of binding that tie them together are a constant tug of war and game of one-upsmanship. You can see this very clearly in the novel Von Horseman by Ben Counter, when Egrim forces Hiskernath the Horror into his service. He can't afford to let the demon have any free will or say in the matter whatsoever, so upon threat of stating his true name and granting him a true death, one that would not allow the demon to return to the warp, they ink a contract in sizzling blood on Egrim's own skin. A contract that Hiskernath would still try to worm his way out of eventually, but one that would take many centuries to escape from, by which point it would essentially be irrelevant. On the mortal plane, much like Slaanesh, Tzeentch spreads his influence through underground cabals and cults, where mages, scholars, and other educated members of society labor in the search for knowledge, whatever the cost of their morals or sanity. Even the colleges of magic are a ripe target, because there is nothing in this world Tzeentch enjoys more than corrupting the incorruptible, and no small number of wizards have been swayed from Altdorf to pledge allegiance to the ruinous powers. In Cathay, worship of Tzeentch is not even hidden. It's a cancer that it's allowed to grow freely right out in the open as an officially recognized cult, which is an absolutely horrendous idea, and in 40k would mean an orbital bombardment from on high for breakfast, just followed by a couple cyclonic torpedoes, and would be considered heresy of the absolute highest order, but in that society, ends up being fine, and they haven't fallen completely to Tzeentch yet, so I guess it's worked out alright. But in the far north, he and Slaanesh are the least worshipped of the chaotic pantheon, in part due to the fact that very few can actually wield his gifts. Slaanesh doesn't have very many fanboys there either, because wild orgies and drug-fueled benders are relatively impractical when every day is a simple struggle for survival, but amongst the Norskin and Kurgan people, seers, sorcerers, and lords are the most likely to rep Team Raven. And so while the numbers of his worship are very small, that worship is very meaningful and very powerful, because sorcerers are often the most dangerous individual in a tribe, as one might expect from a being who can wield the warp itself. The Liar Prince makes his home in the realms of chaos, an impossible fortress of mazes and hallucinations that form the heart of his kingdom. And perhaps more importantly, it's a Garden of Eden of sorts for those who seek knowledge above all else. Literally, the collective wisdom of the entire universe resides within his hidden library, and at its center, Tzeentch gazes into the magic waters of the Well of Eternity, giving him access to past, future, and present day. And within each skein of fate are 14,605,000 potential outcomes, and he manipulates each and every one to his own ends. Visiting his sanctum is, at its core, just a really bad trip. It's nonsensical, it's incomprehensible, it's illogical, it makes no sense to mortal eyes. Just layer upon layer of interdimensional BS, all kind of woven together. And so, unlike the brass citadels of Khorne, or the martyr fortress of Slaanesh, Tzeentch doesn't need his little minions running around protecting the place. The walkways to his citadel are a Hunger Games of mind traps, any number of which will drive a visitor, be they mortal or demon, insane. Purpose turns to longing, ambition to despair, and soon even the strongest and most willful trespassers go mad as their own nightmares are made manifest and their grip on sanity is lost forever. Only the Lords of Change can walk its halls safely, treading the secret paths that lead to the hidden library itself, and even these exalted greater demons are bound in service and suffering to the Puppet Master. If you're not in the realms of chaos, and you're a run-of-the-mill sorcerer putting in some work in the snowy tundra or criminal underbelly of the Empire, then Tzeentch might see fit to bless you with his mark. In many cases, this is a very, very bad thing. As we know, one of the unfortunate side effects of being under the gaze of chaos is that mutation can grow unabated, like a cancer. And if you cannot handle all that power, well, you turn into a spawn, a vaguely humanoid freak of nature that loses all sentience and ability to reason, which is a particularly horrifying fate for those who pride themselves on their intelligence and ability to wield the winds of magic. But for those who survive the transformation and receive his mark without turning, they get some pretty damn nice toys to play with. For one, being able to see the future, both on a micro scale as you duel an opponent, and on a grander scale as the years and decades pass. That's incredibly beneficial, and this is one of the more powerful gifts the Raven gives his homies. I mean, seriously, if you could see your life stretched out before you, and you knew what path would lead to where, only pursuing those that would benefit you the most, be it in terms of wealth, or happiness, or accumulation of power, that's a pretty big deal. You can live your best life when you know what paths to go down. Those few who succeed in drawing his gaze are blessed twofold with incredible martial skill and the arcane might of the Lord of Magic. And though they typically don't have the pure blade skill of Khorne's champions, or the durability of Nurgle, or the speed of Slaanesh, their understanding and manipulation of time, of the warp, and their ability to augment themselves through spells means that they are more dangerous on a grander scale than a chosen berserker ever could be. Because magic, as we know at this point, is hands down the most devastating weapon in the setting, when used as such. The sky above their warbands crackles with unholy energy, their armor strengthened by the most powerful magics, their banners animated to screech and howl and imbue terror in their foe, and that's before the fires come. Eldritch flame that ensorcels their weapons, powers their demons, and is unleashed in torrent after torrent from the staves and mouths of his followers. They are the best strategists and have the greatest minds for warfare in the hordes of chaos, true disciples of the art of war, able to foresee thousands of different outcomes, prepare for any eventuality, and ultimately outmaneuver their opponents on the battlefield, whether it be through sheer force of arms or simply better positioning and ambush potential. But a huge reason for the success Tzeentch has had in terms of conquest are the assets he has at his disposal. And with that in mind, let's talk about the Chaos Warriors and Demons at his beck and call, and what separates them from the other factions of Chaos. The Demons of Tzeentch are wild, some of the most ridiculous units in the setting, both from a tactical perspective and from a visual one, where many don't even remotely resemble anything approaching human. Inherently magical creatures, like their lord, they can shift shape and form, shimmering in and out of reality, appearing often as beings made of pure starlight. Their very march can bend and mold reality around them, aging objects centuries and seconds, and twisting the environment to a more pleasing form as visions and hallucinations rack the minds of those who gaze upon them. Pink and blue horrors are the lesser demons of the Raven, the most common foot soldiers in Tzeentch's armies, and they live and die by a pretty simple creed. Horrors are pink, horrors are blue, where once there was one, now there are two. Which sounds kinda cute, kinda adorable actually, and in their own freakish way, they kinda do look like a little guy deserving of a boop on the snoot. But the only way you're getting that hand back is if it's burning in eldritch flame. They form the vanguard of magically adept armies, rushing forward in a mass of flailing limbs and leering faces, blasting huge waves of energy, and taking the brunt of gunpowder lines and cavalry charges from their opponent. But there's a pretty huge issue when choosing to take down a pink horror. They're gonna split, right down the middle when they die, and become two blue horrors in their place, a smaller dickhead version of the bigger pink guys. So what you'll see on the battlefield is 120 pink horrors get murdered, then transform into 240 much angrier little blue guys. Any one of them can turn a fully armored knight to ash, so you can imagine facing down entire regiments of Tzeentchian twins would get pretty terrifying. One thing you'll notice as we move through these units is their heavy emphasis on fire, which can't really be overstated as an effect when it comes to psychological warfare. Death by flame is 100% one of the worst ways to die, especially when it's essentially warp-infused napalm that will force you to undergo painful mutation as you burn. Only thing worse than watching as your skin and muscle melts away is if that's accompanied by tentacles sprouting out of your armpits and your ass turning into a ferocious carnivorous mouth. Fires of change show no mercy. and it is hands down one of the scariest tools in the entire arsenal of chaos, which is saying a lot. Now, Flamers of Tzeentch use it to pretty good effect too. Freaky looking dudes who, despite their name, don't use true fire, but a form of raw warp energy that can have any number of effects on its victims. They float like jellyfish in the breeze, almost fungus-like in appearance, but covered with gaping maws on their arms, on their chest, where their face should be, and at the base of their skirt, each of which can propel blast after blast of multicolored death at an enemy. When bathing an opponent in warp fire, the recipient could mutate immediately into Chaos Spawn, they could be frozen in time, they could have their soul immediately ripped out and sent howling into the Immaterium, or it could literally just drench them head to toe in strawberry soda, making them go mad, then melting them into a puddle from the inside as they gobble down that sweet nectar. These demons are often first into the breach during assaults on citadels because stone, wood, and cover offers little to no protection against their flames. Burning Chariots of Tzeentch are where things start getting even crazier. These are demon engines meant as mobile flamethrower platforms, able to slice through infantry and melee and blast enemies from afar with magic from the Exalted Flamer and Little Blue Man group of death and destruction that ride it into battle. Even Heralds of Tzeentch ride them sometimes, but because they're too lazy and impatient to train mounts themselves, they often have to Avada Kedavra or otherwise trick the Flamer into giving up their chariot before they can take control. Screamers are essentially Chaos Manta Rays, which means they are huge dickheads by their very nature. Rest in peace, Steve Urban. But just like their counterparts from Earth, they are purely instinctual beings. No sentience or reason whatsoever. What they do have, though, is a powerful sixth sense that draws them to extremes of emotion. And as beings of pure energy, they soar on the winds of magic, swooping and screeching until they find a target they can eviscerate, which is exactly how they fight, by gliding through enemy ranks with the barbs and armor-piercing spikes that line their bodies, scything opponents apart, then swooping around for another go. But because of their incredible speed, they are highly sought after by sorcerers and champions, who tend to relatively enjoy their intestines and limbs being just where they are, so instead of using screamers in their original form, they craft them into a more pleasing, safer form, one that won't slice them into pieces the second they turn their back. These are the Discs of Tzeentch, a screamer pressed and prodded and molded into a being better able to serve. And of course, we cannot forget the Lords of Change, the greater Daemons of Tzeentch, a being we know well from Total War Warhammer, Sartorial the Everwatcher, who I imagine is but a pale imitation of what the Raven will unleash in Game 3. These are the big birds of chaos, the greatest demonic sorcerers in the Immaterium, masters of magic, of time, of devastation. They can take the form of anyone or anything, but generally prefer the look of an avian predator on spindly legs, with great jet black wings and massive rending claws. These are the greatest strategists, the greatest casters, and the greatest leaders of Tzeentch's demonic armies. So, let's talk about tactics and how Tzeentch will actually get down on the battlefields of Total War. As you probably already worked out by now, this is not just the most magic-focused faction in the realms of chaos, it's arguably the most magically adept race in all of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Even their crappiest, lowest tier lesser demons are spellcasters with access to the lore of Tzeentch. Across the board, whether we're talking about the Warriors of Chaos or demons, they deal magical damage, they have access to bound spells, they have built-in physical and magical resist, and will likely have flaming attacks to boot. The Mark of Tzeentch grants his followers a built-in ward save and better spellcasting potential, and in heavy contrast to Nurgle and Khorne, who typically like to brute force and meat grind their way across the Empire, Tzeentch is the flashiest, but also the most strategic of the bunch. Not quite as mobile, nor quite as ostentatious as Slaanesh, at least when it comes to their mortal pawns. His style of combat is unique amongst the Runa's powers, in that it has by far the heaviest focus on ranged DPS, and it is all about righteous, glorious flame. The pink and blue horrors will be the first onto the breach, gibbering and howling and munching any and all that fall in their path, and when supported by a herald, will find their forms swell with unholy power, unleashing magical energy in torrents of rainbow-colored flame. Flamers, Screamers, and Burning Chariots harry the flanks, swooping in and out of combat and incinerating edges of their formations, surrounding them with walls of fire while Chaos Manta Rays bisect entire lines of infantry as they fly through. Tzeentch is a master of psychological warfare, invading the minds of the foe, turning brother against brother, sowing confusion and discord amongst their ranks, all the while closing the vice and forcing the opponent into tighter and tighter confinements until at last the Lords of Change stride forth and drop ungodly firestorms on the devastated survivors. It's a beautiful but horrifying thing to watch, and on average, it's the thing that differentiates the average Tzeentch Lord from those of his brothers. A mastery of the strategic elements of warfare. The Raven may care for his followers less than the others, but in battle, there is no wasted motion. No unnecessary glory hounding, no suiciding entire regiments of cultists or lesser demons for no reason, unless it's just as planned. It's just pure, economical, efficient, and utterly ruthless combat. And by very nature of this clinical precision and the heavy emphasis on range combat, casualties are often super low for Tzeentch. If you're flaming dudes from dozens of meters away, they're gonna have a very hard time closing the gap on you and beating up your squishy nerds in melee. And you can't lose many of your number if your enemies are already burned to ash before they can ever touch you. But ultimately, that is one of Tzeentch's primary weaknesses. His CQB and tankiness are very much on the lower end of the spectrum for the Chaos Gods. Very much a glass cannon army that can fall apart like a jigsaw in the box once a sturdier opponent actually manages to close the gap. And remember, the demons crumble, much like undead. Their binding fades the worst combat's going for them, which is what balances out their higher ward saves and their high physical resist. It's such a unique army and aesthetic though, that in many ways I feel it embodies chaos more than any other faction. When I think of the otherworldly aspects of the warp, the insanity of it, how alien it must be, Tzeentch wholly and truly embodies all of that. Because at the end of the day, chaos is change, and his fires will change you pretty quick. Into spawn or ash, it matters not. Now, one of his coolest mechanics on the tabletop comes straight from the Reign of Chaos board. If you roll an 11 with 2d6 for demonic possession, your opponent must pass a leadership test, and if they fail, their spellcaster gets replaced by a demonic herald immediately. As in, a demonic entity literally crawls out of that Empire mage's ass. And if you just so happen to be playing Tzeentch, that herald gets to cast their spells as soon as it materializes. I doubt we'll be seeing anything quite that wild transferred directly to Total War Warhammer 3 in terms of gameplay mechanics, but my lord, would that be an incredibly satisfying feature to have as a demon player. And ultimately, possession is a major component of what Tzeentch is all about. Now, in terms of mechanics I'd like to see translated directly into Total War, pink horrors turning into blue horrors upon death is right there at the top of the list. But campaign mechanics are ultimately going to be much more important because that's where the Warriors of Chaos campaign currently falls apart. It's really boring and really frustrating to play currently. Biggest issue, of course, is that everything you raise immediately gets resettled by another faction. So you're basically playing a 20-hour game of whack-a-mole as you chase down these tiny unit stacks that keep resettling burnt-out provinces. Very little of their current implementation makes them fun to play on the campaign map, but of course that can and will change when Game 3 rolls around. What's there for the battles is quite good. Obviously, the Chaos Gods themselves will give them a whole lot more flavor, but even Chaos Undivided, I think, is quite fun to play at the moment. Cults and Cabals, though, are a huge part of what makes Tzeentch a threat on the mortal plane, and I think this needs to be reflected on the campaign map as well. I don't necessarily think there should be a full Under Empire mechanic for his sub-faction, as in like a full set of different buildings and effects like the Skaven have, but the ability to actually summon or construct portals within a city to spawn demonic incursions or even summon greater demons would be really cool. And I think this could be achieved any number of ways. For one, your heralds, sorcerers, and hero characters could establish a cult in a city, and over the course of, say, 5 or 10 turns, they'd establish themselves and spread their tendrils a bit in the underbelly of that population center. You get a couple of choices. For one, you could build a ritual summoning site, choosing to go for a low-level summoning building that has much less chance of being discovered, but can maybe only cause some minor damage, or you could go for the big guns, building up tiers to a point where you could summon a huge army or a greater demon. But you would need very high corruption, and each higher tier of the portal would make it easier and easier to spot, giving the Inquisition the ability to do something about it. Chaos Fortresses are a must in Game 3 as well. The pure Chaos Horde playstyle just really isn't fun. I don't think people have really gravitated towards that playstyle much at all, and they obviously shouldn't be able to settle anywhere. It is Chaos, but in the Chaos Wastes, we should definitely get a starting base in the Citadel of Change, and the ability to form a stronghold in select major cities would really help liven up the entire thing. or simply allow them to create warp rifts wherever they raise, which is already technically what Chaos does in Game 1 and Game 2, but those warp rifts aren't actually usable besides causing corruption. So I think it'd be sweet if they would actually allow you to summon demons from these rifts to quickly replenish losses and gain access to units on the front lines. Rites should also play a really important role in the Demons of Chaos campaign, allowing you to summon greater demons after sacrificing a certain number of prisoners to a god of your choosing. That should be a pretty big deal and kind of hard to do when you finally get a real greater demon on the material plane. That's not a simple thing. And greater demons, despite being punching bags in the lore that seem to only really exist and be designed as characters that get murdered by other named characters to make them seem more badass, are actually a really, really big deal in the lore. So I'd like them to be handled in a manner similar to maybe Slann Mage Priests, but actually make them worth it and viable to use. Lords of Change need to have a massive skill tree with fantastic spell selection, greater arcane conduit, and some huge buffs for lesser demons as well. In terms of recruitment, it's clear that demons cannot sustain themselves on the mortal plane indefinitely. They aren't like normal foot soldiers or chaos warriors. They need an abundance of magic to maintain corporeal form. So it's very possible they'll take attrition in between turns, especially in areas without the necessary corruption. But like the undead, you'll be able to replenish those losses much quicker than other races by simply winning battles and by sucking the magic out of their dead casters. And a great way to take that mechanic even further is to make the Winds of Magic stance a lot more useful and tie it to their replenishment and summoning. The harder the winds blow, the more magic is available in the area, the easier time demons have partying it up on the real world. I would be a huge fan of a mechanic that lets special right summon characters go anywhere on the map and begin channeling a spell that takes, say, 5 turns to complete, that lets nearby enemies be alerted as magic coalesces around them. But if that spell is completed, a warp rift opens up on the map right on that spot, and you could summon a demonic army straight onto that part of the world. It would be very lore friendly and would give them the crazy lightning quick invasion tactic they're so well known for, but only high corruption and Winds of Magic in that area would allow them to sustain on the mortal plane for long. And thankfully, unlike Slaanesh, Tzeentch has a ton of awesome and very well fleshed out named characters on both the warriors and the demon side of things, so they're going to be absolutely spoiled for choice when it comes to legendary lords and heroes. It won't be like Slaanesh, where we only had like Nakari, Mask of Slaanesh, Sigvald, and Dakala, like very minor amount of characters there. Here, it's a much broader scope, and from a much longer period of the Warhammer setting. So you've got Old Hammer, you've got stuff from newer lore. It all kind of conglomerates a bit to make for a really interesting selection of characters. And as I've stated before, I think the best way to handle a Tzeentch roster would be to have a Greater Demon Lord and a Warriors of Chaos Lord as the 2 starting legendary lords. It is the best way to get the most flavor and most variety out of the faction. And this narrows things down pretty tremendously and helps us out. So that leaves Kairos Fateweaver as the most logical demon lord. He's a Lord of Change, the greatest of his kind, the keeper of Tzeentch's hidden library, and a being who knows literally every spell in existence. Because Tzeentch is a massive dick and eternally hungry for knowledge, decided, hey, I'm not too keen on letting myself get torn up by time itself. I'm not going to jump into the Well of Eternity, so I'm going to grab Kairos by his neck in the heart of the Impossible Fortress, throw him into the pool, and watch and wait and see what happens. And when the double-headed Lord of Change crawled his way back out, he was a hell of a lot smarter and could read the skeins of fate even better than Tzeentch himself. The problem is that while Tzeentch is a master of time, both past, present, and future, Kairos cannot read the present, which makes him a little bit vulnerable in battle. He's actually quite a bit less useful than some of the other Lords of Change when it comes to a battlefield practicality setting. But he makes up for this by understanding past and future better than literally any other character in Warhammer Fantasy, which unfortunately did not save him when Archie the Gary Stew sliced his heads off in the end time to summon Kabanda. Both in lore and in tabletop, Kairos is hands down a top 3 spellcaster, one of the best in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, arguably the greatest magic user in the game. He knows every basic Winds of Magic and lore of Tzeentch, and instead of having to roll for a spell selection, he gets to pick 4 spells for each of his heads. He has 2 heads, so he gets 8 spells there, and on one head he gets Life, Metal, Light, and Heavens, and on the other he gets Death, Beast, Shadow, and Fire. this will likely translate to him having the largest skill tree of any character in Warhammer 3. One of the few characters in the setting who is a true lore master of multiple lores of magic. He gets a 4-up ward save with Oracle of Eternity, and just like Sartorial, will end up being a high mass, terror-causing, quickly moving monster who can disrupt enemy formations and generally cause mayhem all over a battlefield. But where Sartorial is a strong melee combatant, Kairos might give up a bit of that in return for a higher ward save and significantly better casting potential. At the end of the day, the Everwatcher is a baby back beach compared to the homies Chaos has yet to unleash. He'll give upkeep reductions to Flamers and Horrors and synergize exceptionally well with magic-focused builds, because that mana pool is going to be gigantic, especially with his Staff of Tomorrow, granting him even more casting potential on top of Greater Arcane Conduit. Now the second Lord is an interesting choice because there are a lot of ways CA could go here. If they want to go old school, they could pull out Echoed Hellbrass from Old Hammer, a Chaos champion gifted with the Breath of Life. Where he walks, life follows. Meadows blossom, trees grow out of rock and desert, and allies are healed all around him as he wields his great sword Windblade. But I'd be surprised to see him. He's a character that mods should be able to handle just fine, and he's seriously way back. They could go for the Changeling or the Blue Scribes, two hero-level casters from the 8th edition Armybook for Demons. Some very interesting lore and mechanics as well, but ultimately I think they might fall victim to Epidemia Syndrome, a perfectly worthy and awesome hero-level character outshone by his greater demon counterpart. Characters like that have a decent shot at making it in as DLC later down the line, but on launch I feel like it's much less likely. So because I think it's going to be pretty logical to have Warriors of Chaos have that second Lord slot, I think that honor will go to one of two characters. Either Village the Curseling, if CA decides to stick with the current army books, or Agram von Horseman, if the Warhammer 1 cinematic ends up meaning a lot to them, and it very well might. Now, Agram I've covered before in multiple videos. I think he's one of the most interesting and tragic characters in Warhammer Fantasy, period. A light wizard who wormed his way to the top of the Altdorf Colleges of Magic, into the upper echelon of Hysh, ends up summoning a demonic entity within the Inner Sanctums, unleashes a slumbering Chaos Dragon chained beneath the Pyramid of Light, burns dozens of priceless and irreplaceable tomes of knowledge, and ultimately communes with an aspect of Tzeentch himself. Literally talks to the man himself. A decade-long tale of betrayal that almost ends the entire Light Order forever, and just to rub salt in the wound, the dude flies off into the north and establishes a dark mirror of those very colleges in the Chaos Wastes, calls them the Cabal, and every so often coaxes a few more aspiring Altdorf mages into his Chaos Coven. But fear not, Tzeentch stole his soul after having Baldros flame him to ash, then resurrected him just to show him who's truly boss in the north. Perfect example of how even the brightest and bravest men of the Empire can sometimes fall to chaos. He's a Lore of Light and Lore of Tzeentch dual caster with a gigantic Chaos Dragon named Baldros, and heavily inspired the Warhammer 1 announcement cinematic. So if you've seen that trailer, which each and every one of you have, that is basically Agram von Horseman in all but name. I think he's got a good shot to make it in eventually, but I think Village the Curseling, the Twisted Twin, will do the launch day honors come Q3 of next year. For one, the dude has a sick model, a stunted, angry little runt fused to his Conan the Barbarian brother. He was Tzeentch's mortal representative as a lord choice in 8th for the Warriors of Chaos Armybook, and he's got some pretty awesome lore to go with it. A pair of twins born far in the north, Thoman the Chad and Village the Runt. Thoman was handsome and strong and athletic, and he was also a huge dick. He'd beat Village just for the fun of it. The Runt was stunted and weak and had no real way to defend himself, hated by his father and the rest of the tribe, and so Village prayed every night to Tzeentch to swap their roles, to enslave his brother and make him the champion. One Geheimnisnacht, it happened. The Changer of Ways laughed and laughed as he reversed their fates, fusing the twins together and obliterating Thoman's mind. The big boy would become the mindless broad of the bunch, while Village and his fledgling magical powers were multiplied exponentially. And just as planned, he strode out of his tent that night cackling as he melted the majority of his tribe. But the strongest warriors he spared, enslaving their minds and creating the very first Rubric Marines in history. Ahriman would be proud. He's a level 4 wizard of the lore of Tzeentch with a good stat line, although CA is seriously going to have to rework Footlords moving into Game 3 or I'll piss myself, and he has an arcane item called the Vessel of Chaos. In the absence of Dispelling, which we will likely never see in Total War, it could function as an item that increases enemy miscast chance map-wide, while massively improving your own power reserves every time an opponent casts a spell. Or they could go the easy route and just make it recharge rate and power reserves in terms of a buff, which, as useful as that is, especially for a caster, is getting pretty overplayed at this point, so I'd like them to see a little bit, I'd like them to branch out a bit more. I think it's making the different playstyles of Magic disappear a lot, which is unfortunate. The whole Magic system in Total War just isn't quite as complex or interesting as I feel like it could be. But maybe we'll see some new mechanics implemented over the next year or so. Galrouch is also an option, a great Chaos Dragon from the time of Anarion, who also happens to be a very powerful wizard with the lore of Tzeentch, eternally at war with itself. One of the heads will actually attack the other at certain points in the tabletop game, and if you pass the leadership test, you basically overcome that and are able to cast your spells normally. Don't know if that will get translated, but it would definitely be very interesting. I think Galrouch makes a lot of sense as DLC. We've not seen a sentient Chaos Dragon really yet, one that can control itself, one that can cast spells, and have the Dark Fire of Chaos and all that good stuff. I think that'd be pretty sick. But there are a ton of named characters for Tzeentch with unique playstyles, so I wouldn't mind at all if we got some additional Chaos vs. Chaos Lord packs to help flesh them out, because if they want to be fleshed out fully, there are going to be a lot of characters on display. In my dream world, we'd have 4 for each god, so I'd be super happy if we got Kairos Fate Weaver, Village the Curseling, Galrouch the Great Chaos Dragon, and Agrabah Horseman ended up as being the final 4. Now, with the Lords out of the way, I want to talk roster implementation, how these units would actually function and look on the battlefields of Total War. The mortal side of things is relatively easy. Chaos Warriors, Chosen, and Chaos Knights with the Mark of Tzeentch would have an additional ward save, magical attacks, and flaming damage. Clad head to toe in Baroque midnight blue armor with gold and silver trim, they'd look quite a bit more regal and ornate than the Warriors of Nurgle or Khorne, and I think a Thousand Suns type of aesthetic with the tall headgear and raven or eagle shoulder pads would look amazing. Pink Horrors will be your frontline screeners. Picture kind of like Levi Freeman from Rome 2 with those unbelievably annoying precursor javelins. And that's basically what you'd be getting here, but gibbering hentai monsters that shoot flame instead. Cheap to field, they're actually treated as level 1 wizards of the lore of Tzeentch, but that will be represented in-game by giving them a magic missile bounce spell on top of their ranged flamethrower attack, giving them one legit missile bounce spell that only their iridescent horror captain could cast, paired with some ranged DPS, just their normal ranged flamethrower, would make them surprisingly versatile, especially when you consider that upon death, the unit will split into blue horrors in their place. Picture something like Morgar's Chaos Spawn summon, but it affects your own unit instead of the enemies. So you have 120 pink horrors, they all die, and a new one spawns in their place when they're down to about 10%, 15% HP. There will likely be a few summon spells for the pink horrors and blue horrors as well. Heralds of Tzeentch are hero versions of horrors that have access to Tzeentch and metal, so expect 3 spells from each, and they can be mounted on flying discs or burning chariots. Speaking of which, discs are a super cool mount, a flying saucer, UFO kind of thing. They'll be moving at 85 speed or above. They're going to give casters a crap ton of mobility and escape potential, which is exactly what they need, otherwise they're going to get absolutely dumpstered in melee. Burning Chariots are even cooler. Number 1 on my list of craziest units coming in Warhammer 3. They can tackle any unit in the game as they have the choice of unleashing 2 different shooting attacks. Pink Fire is great for chunking through single entities and monsters, and Blue Fire has a grape shot effect, great for eliminating blocks of infantry. And the fact that they can fly allows them to position incredibly well for maximum killing power. Add to that the fact that Screamers of Tzeentch are scythed and barbed and meant for close combat, and have that Lamprey's Bite, which gives them a bonus for large, and this becomes yet another incredibly versatile artillery platform that doubles as a melee monster, with the added benefit of being able to fly overhead and easily position for a brutal rear charge as well. It's a flame-shooting, sneaky stabbing, magical chariot of death and disaster that is quite unlike anything we've seen in the trilogy thus far, and looks completely insane to boot. Probably the best unit in the entirety of the roster. Screamers are going to be your back line and flank harassers, a really versatile unit and just have a ton of mobility for days. They have the Lamprey's Bite, which gives them a bonus versus large, and they're great for rear charging cavalry or chunking down isolated monsters, while slashing attack gives them a reliable way to deal damage without getting hit in return. And it kind of simulates their ability to swoop down and slice through a unit at max speed before circling around for another go. Flamers are going to be incredibly annoying for opponents to deal with. Picture a Javcav with flamethrowers. They've got movement speed 6 on the tabletop. They've got good mobility, skirt around the flanks and blast units from the rear with gouts of Warp Flame. And we'll talk about that craziness of that special rule in just a minute. We also got Lords of Change, the cream of the crop, the greater Daemons of Tzeentch. They have fantastic mobility, a great stat line, high mass, some of the best casters in the game. They're supposed to fly, but like many units in Total War Warhammer that are supposed to fly, they probably won't if the Everwatcher is any indication, but they'll still have those amazing animations that let you glide into opponents and kind of dodge missiles, high missile resist, and they have Lore of Metal or Lore of Tzeentch. In campaign, they'll probably get both lores or a blended skill tree with the best spells from each. So what this roster gives you is a unique set of Chaos Warriors with access to flaming and magical attacks, an absolute nightmare for factions like the Wood Elves, and a bunch of high mobility demons who blast fire out of every orifice and just shred stuff from range. If you're a pyromaniac who just wants to watch the world burn, this is probably going to be the faction for you. So, to close this all up and put the cherry on top, a very long video, let's finish up with the lore of Tzeentch, shall we? Now, unfortunately, the lore of Tzeentch was widely considered one of the worst lores of Magic in 8th edition, which is pretty ironic, considering that Tzeentch is supposed to have the best casters. There were a couple issues with its implementation in the tabletop that wouldn't necessarily translate to Total War or could be easily fixed. For one, the Warriors and Daemons of Chaos are generally considered close combat armies, but most of these spells can't be cast in CQB on the tabletop. Probably not going to be an issue in Game 3, because that kind of mechanic isn't how the game or spellcasting works. The bigger issue, though, was the Warp Flame special rule, which was an ability that caused units like Flamers to deal significantly more damage if their victims failed a toughness test, but granted them regeneration if they passed it. The stupid thing about that special rule, something that had to be an oversight, was that Warp Flame and the huge variety of spells that actually have fire in their names do not deal flaming damage on the tabletop. So basically you have a chance to grant regen to an opponent, but not actually punish it with your flaming attacks, because none of the spells in the lore of Tzeentch actually deal fire damage. Really dumb. Something you really don't want to be giving your opponent is regen, and when you don't have a way to punish it easily, that just gets pretty stupid and no one wants to bring the lore. Thankfully, these issues could be fixed relatively easily in the translation to Warhammer 3. The lore attribute for demons is Fires of Change, one of my favorites from the source material because it lets you automatically generate horrors and screamers every time your spells deal damage. I'd like to see this make it in just as advertised, just as it worked on the tabletop game. The more casting you do, the more winds of magic you use, the more summons your caster gets. Pretty dope. Blue Fires of Tzeentch is the signature spell, a magic missile better versus low armor targets. Similar to Fireball that can be bound to pink horrors, it'd be good for sniping out squishy characters like Skrulk or ripping through the flank of a cavalry unit. Treason of Tzeentch is a hex spell that torments its victims with whispers of mistrust and betrayal, lowering leadership in an AoE, similar to Doom and Darkness, and a great way to set up terror routes with your Lords of Change and other scary units. Pink Fire of Tzeentch is a roiling tide of magical flame that would probably function like a breath spell, similar to Tyrion's Sunfang or Wind Blast, great for deleting low armor units like skeletons or clan rats, lets you get the chaff off the field really quick, so your casters can focus their attention on more important threats. And Bolt of Change is a high penetration AP magic missile, more similar to Ikiclaw's Storm Demon bound spell than Fireball. This is what you'd want to use if you want to take down a heavily armored single entity. Glean Magic is definitely my favorite spell from the lore of Tzeentch. It steals a random spell from your opponent's arsenal, deals direct damage, and prevents the opponents from casting that spell again for the rest of the match. In terms of translation to Total War, this would probably just put the stolen spell on cooldown, but I want this to be coded in as a legit spell steal, as in, I cast Glean Magic on your Empire Wizard, and I literally put that spell on a 120-second cooldown while gaining it from my own caster. Might be difficult to implement that way. I'm not sure it's actually doable with the coding they have, but given its true form, it will probably be one of the coolest spells in the game if it's implemented properly. Rubik is a minion of Tzeentch confirmed, for those of you guys who like Dota 2. So, Tzeentch's Firestorm is a blue vortex, similar to Flamestorm, from the Lore of Fire. Essentially the exact same spell, except that it doesn't deal flaming damage for some reason. Makes no sense. This will get rectified in Warhammer 3. And finally, Infernal Gateway is a powerful direct damage spell that can devastate low model count units in a similar manner to Fate of Buna, but visually should look a hell of a lot more interesting as a portal to the warp is opened up above the target and the fires of change lash out from that rent in reality. This and Firestorm are going to be the expensive and heavily damaging spells of the bunch. But that is it, guys. That is your look at the lore of Tzeentch, and by extension, the lore of Tzeentch. We've covered all his narration and how he was formed in the warp, how his units function, and all that good stuff. That is my overview of the warriors and demons of the Lord of Change and how that can be implemented in Total War Warhammer 3. I think it's going to be an incredibly unique faction with a very interesting playstyle and its own unique aesthetic, and will offer a lot on both the battlefield and the campaign side of things when they finally launch sometime next year. As always, let me know what units and features you would most like to see when the Daemons of Chaos make their way into the third game of the trilogy. Hope you guys have enjoyed this most recent induction into the Lore, Army, and Tactics series, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.